Grades, I suggest we start now. Uh, Welcome to everybody who's joined us. I'm Duncan Bowie. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Socialist History Society. And this evening, we're really pleased to have Patrick Cockburn with us, who is speaking on his new book on his father, Believe Nothing Until It Is Officially Denied, Claud Cockburn and the Invention of Guerrilla Journalism. Many of us know of Patrick's journalism, working, well, mainly for the I newspaper, but obviously publishing in a lot of other journals, clearly known now as an expert on the Middle East, which obviously is quite significant in terms of what appears to be developments today. But this time, Patrick, as I say, is going to speak on his book on his father. Patrick, I think we'll probably speak for sort of between 35 and 45 minutes. We're quite flexible on this. We will then have lots of time for questions. If you can all keep yourselves muted while Patrick is speaking, please avoid putting any comments in the chat while Patrick's speaking, because I know it's very disruptive in a sense, so distracting for the speaker. But when Patrick's finished, we'll take questions. Ideally, if you press under the reactions button, put your hands up, I'll take you in the order. And if you don't know how to use that, make sure your video is on and wave at me, and I'll try and catch you. So thanks very much, Patrick. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and very glad to be here. Rather hurried, since you may have heard about the ceasefire in Gaza. I had to rapidly write 600 words, telling all about that, somewhat prematurely. But I'm obviously talking about this book, which is Believe Nothing Until It's Officially Denied, Claud Cockburn and the Invention of Guerrilla Journalism. It's obviously a biography of my father, Claud Cockburn, but it is also about resistance journalism and how it can succeed against the powers that be. Claud thought a lot about this, the strengths and weaknesses of the mainline media. And many of these features of the media have not changed to this day, almost 100 years later. The 1930s, after all, were called the Devil's Decade because of successive crises, wars, extermination campaigns, and unfortunately the 2020s are looking very much the same. So I think that what he did in the 1930s has many parallels and perhaps some lessons in the current decade. To get ahead of myself a little, I don't know how far you're familiar with my father or his career, but essentially he was partly brought up. He was born in Beijing. His father was a diplomat. He was born in 1904. He came back to England, went to school in England. His father got posted to Budapest. From the age of about 16, he was much in Central Europe. He learnt German. In 1927, he went to work for the Times in Berlin. He moved increasingly, this was during the Weimar Republic, he moved increasingly to the left. The one big question in his mind was, did American capitalism have the answer to political and social problems? Was the books were published called, Ford Answers, Henry Ford, the motor manufacturer answers, Marx, etc. So he got the Times, who liked him a lot, to post him to New York in 1929, and 3 months later, of course, we had the Great Crash and the beginning of the Great Depression in America and then in Europe. But he remained very close to what was happening in Germany. So in 1932, he resigned from the Times to the astonishment of the editor, and returned to Berlin. He stayed there a few months, situation getting worse and worse, and then he was advised, fled Berlin 24 hours before Hitler became Chancellor on 30th of January 1933. He went down to Vienna. He thought, what can I do to oppose the Nazis, who he thought were an ultimate evil? But I should say he was against the whole sort of established order. And he had no job and very little money, but he did have a plan, and he returned to England, set up a newsletter called The Week, which the idea was that he would, at a time when all the mainline media was saying that Hitler was sort of bark was worse than his bite and so forth, didn't make much difference, that in this tremendous vacuum of information, even a small publication which could say what was really happening, not just in Germany or in fascist Italy, but also in the US, where 12 million people were unemployed. If a newsletter which really knew what it was talking about, that could produce real scoops, would not directly influence people, would influence the influencers. In other words, it would influence other journalists who would write up the same stories. It would influence politicians, and it would influence diplomats. It would influence political activists and the trade unions and elsewhere. This was his calculation, which was pretty daring, and it sort of worked out. It takes a lot of journalistic skill to do that sort of thing, and there haven't been many people who've successfully done that. Quite a lot of people have tried to do that, but not many have really succeeded. Private Eye is really closest to probably what The Week was. The Week was produced by one person. Private Eye is produced by many more. But and Claude was heavily involved in the early days of Private Eye. He wrote a column for them, but from the earliest times, he was sort of a mentor when Richard Inglis was editor in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So that's probably the equivalent, the nearest equivalent to The Week, though The Week was politically more radical and aggressive. Overall, in the circumstances of the 30s, Claude thought that in these crises, in this great sort of, where everybody wanted to know what was really happening, that, he said, you could, a quite small noise, a squeak, from quite a small publication, if it got things right, could sound like a scream. So I think that this sort of publication was important. It did have an effect. Obviously, I sort of knew about it when I was growing up. In Ireland, Claude moved to Ireland in 1947. I knew about it, and I wondered, how much influence it really had. And historians didn't seem to talk about it very much. And then in 2003, I applied to MI5 for their files on Claude, and which it turned out they had about 24 bulky files, which they passed on to the National Archives in Kew, and I looked at them. And they were full of sort of furious memos from senior officials in Whitehall, from politicians, from military intelligence, etc., all saying something must be done about this. How did he know what happened at this cabinet meeting? Why is there this attack on some senior permanent secretary or somebody in Whitehall? So reading through this, it became very clear to me that actually it had much greater influence. I think actually much greater influence than my father thought. Why? Well, he always held that the powers that be pretended that they were more contemptuous of sort of resistance than they really were. That they were sort of saying to people, oh, you know, you may oppose what government is doing, but your puny efforts will get you nowhere. But that this was a pretense. In fact, they were much more vulnerable. They're much weaker than they looked. And this was very much borne out by the MI5 papers that I looked at. So I went on sort of gathering information in the years that followed. Claude wrote 3 volumes of autobiography, which are really very good, I mean, well worth reading. But they left out very large parts of his life. Quite why? Reasons of discretion, sometimes personal discretion, sometimes political discretion. So I was sort of surprised about how many new things I learnt along the line. So let me give a sort of resume of Claude's life, because the book is a biography, as I said, but it also tries to use what he did and how he did it as an example of resistance journalism and how it can be made effective. This isn't easy to do. I mean, I've been a professional journalist all my life. It's really difficult to do. And it requires high journalistic skills. It requires political nous. It requires a great deal of determination and stubbornness, but it can be done. Claude was born in Beijing in China in 1904. His father was a British diplomat, but he was a rather sort of peculiar diplomat. And although in some ways Claude's background was that of sort of the British establishment, it differed in various crucial ways, which I'll briefly summarize. I mean, the family is Scottish, comes from Edinburgh. Claude's great-grandfather was somebody called Lord Henry Cockburn, not a lord in the House of Lords, but a Scottish law lord who was very much part of the progressive Scottish Enlightenment. This isn't just of historic interest because his account of sort of progressive politics in Scotland of the Enlightenment at that time, his style was very much rather similar to Claude's. But more immediately, his father was a diplomat, but he spent all his years, he spent 29 years first in China and then in Korea. He spoke perfect Chinese. He'd been posted all over China. He really didn't have much contact with the Foreign Office back in London. And he was also a diplomat whose career was suddenly ended when he was consul general in the senior British diplomat in Korea in 1908, just after Korea had been taken over by a Japanese occupation, and Korean journalists fled to British property. He wouldn't hand him over to the Japanese, saying he was going to be tortured. The Foreign Office ordered him to do so. He finally was forced to do so, but immediately left, got the Trans-Siberian train back to England and left the Foreign Office. This had quite an impact on Claude because his father, who had returned to England as a small child, because his father was with him. He wasn't one of these sort of children of the empire that were sort of brought up in hideous schools in England. And it also that his father, though sort of an imperialist in some ways, was a very sort of dissident one. So Claude was brought up in Tring in Hertfordshire. He went to Berkhamsted School, also slightly different because the headmaster was somebody called Charles Greene, who was the father of Graham Greene, a liberal. This had an impact on Claude. a third factor was simply the Great War. Claude was just lucky enough that he was born in 1904, so he was too young to be recruited. But I think 230 students from Berkhamsted were killed in the war. This was the sort of thing that hung over them, that he was a member of the officer training corps at school, and he'd see sort of people older than him sort of disappear off to the trenches, and they'd sort of hear they were dead a few months later. This had a big impact on his life, and had the impact on the life of anybody politically, I mean, in Europe at the time, but particularly his. But there was one factor, I think, which also changed him, made him different, was his father got a job in Budapest as a diplomat, and he would go over there. So he was brought up partly in Budapest, but also went to Vienna and Germany and so forth. I'd always loved it. He always loved the Danube Valley, Bavaria, and other places like that. So he was much more. There weren't many sort of people like him who actually knew Germany that well during the Weimar period. He was sort of initially very much on the side of the defeated powers. He'd have great rows with his father about the Treaty of Versailles, and what he at the time regarded as a sort of mistreatment of the sort of budding democracies in Germany and Central Europe. Afterwards, he sort of decided his father was not wholly wrong, that he said all these democratic movements, decided that all these democratic movements were really nationalist movements in disguise. And he thought it was kind of absurd that sort of Hungarian landowners and German steel barons should be sort of sympathizing with Maynard Keynes about the oppressive peace treaty. But at the time, he was very much of that way of thinking. He went to Oxford. He, to some extent, sort of traditional career there. But this is a period at Oxford which there were an amazing number of sort of people who became well-known writers afterwards. Graham Greene was one, who was his best friend. Evelyn Waugh was a cousin of his, also spent much of his time with. I should say his relations with Waugh were very close, but then as Claude went to the left and Waugh went to the right, became Catholic and so forth, they talked less and less. They never openly quarreled, but they talked less and less. He's very politically minded. In 2024, there was a rather sort of amazing journey by Graham Greene and himself, that the French and I think the Belgians had occupied the Ruhr, and this was part of their sort of territorial grabs. They set up something called the Revolver Republic. Graham Greene and Claude decided to go and investigate sort of atrocities there. They traveled to there. The first mention I found in the MI5 files about Claude was a military intelligence report saying that 2 students from Oxford called Graham Greene and Claud Cockburn have turned up. It says they claim to be writers. But it was quite sort of enterprising thing to do for students who were in their 20s. Claude wanted to couldn't quite decide what to do, but he did ultimately decide to go back to Germany. He worked very hard, got a sort of scholarship, traveling fellowship from Queen's College, Oxford. And this took him to Berlin in 1927. This was the high point of Weimar. He turned up at the Times office in Berlin, and suggesting that he work for them. He also suggested he work for them for free. and somewhat to his surprise, they said yes. But he spoke good German. He could read the newspapers for them. Maybe it's not that so surprising. He was a very good reporter. He very swiftly made his name a few months after he'd arrived. He was there were sort of reports from a big disastrous flood in Saxony, south of Dresden, and the Times wouldn't sort of give him any money to go there, but he thought there might be a good story, so he got a train. But he had so little money, he had to get sort of commuter trains that crisscrossed Germany, and eventually got down to the mountains south of Dresden, where there had been tremendous floods in the narrow valleys there, and 100 people dead and so forth. This rather made his name with the Times. But he wasn't sure how much he really wanted to work for them. At the same time, he began to move into much more sort of left-wing circles in Berlin and Vienna. There was something called the Schwarzwald circle that which people, I mean, of all descriptions, who were most influenced by the Bolshevik Revolution, whether they were for or against it. They regard this as a tremendous event in the history of Europe, in a way that nobody else he'd really come across in Oxford or anywhere else in Vienna, but really sort of was plugged into this. So he moved sharply to the left. As I said earlier, this is sort of high point of Weimar. Germany hadn't collapsed yet. But he also felt that he must go and look at America. So he told the Times he'd take a regular job with them, but on the condition they sent him to New York. He went to New York and spent 3 months there, and then the great crash happened. I mean, on Wall Street, and actually that's where the title of the book, "Believe Nothing Until It's Officially Denied," comes from, because he was in Wall Street. I'm actually in Wall Street itself on the day of the crash. A senior banker working for J.P. Morgan said that made a statement saying everything is going to be okay, that there'll be steadiness in the markets. And Claude wrote that he said it was Knowles' Fleet Street adage, but actually it seems to be largely invented by himself, that this phrase came to his mind, or this saying came to his mind, that believe nothing until it's officially denied. And he realized that a disaster had happened. Also, his boss at the Times, when he was writing his copy on that day, leant over him at one point and said, "Whatever you do, the word panic is not to be used." He realized that the panic had really started, and that, of course, went on for 3 years. You know, he liked the US. He sort of liked it in many ways more than England. And he was successful. I mean, he interviewed Al Capone, whom he thoroughly disliked, and actually refused to run the interview because he thought he was not going to. The Times had sent a message saying, "Interview Capone, not unduly emphasizing crime." And he did. Capone sort of went on about the virtues of American capitalism, saying his rackets were all run on American lines, and he didn't. He thought, "I'm not going to run this," so he didn't run it. But come 1932, things were getting worse and worse in Germany. He was very much in contact with them, so he decided to resign from the Times. The editor Dawson was very upset by this, but off he did that. Went back to Europe, went to Berlin, as I said earlier, by that stage, I mean, he letters back are very interesting about what he found in Vienna. He found in the main hotels that the the beggars would come and stand beside you. That the hospitals were shutting because there was no schools were shutting because there was no fuel. When he got to Berlin, he found that there was this, stormtroopers were in the streets. There was a sense of impending disaster, and that came. So then he went to at the last moment. He found that he was sorry, I hope this machine is working. There's something saying David Margolis. I can't see anything else. So I hope you're receiving me.
It's working okay, Patrick. Just
You're
carry on.
working. Sorry, you completely disappeared. I was wondering what had happening. I seem to be staring at a blank screen. Okay, well, let me continue. So he went down to Vienna, and he thought, what can I do? So he decided to set up this newsletter called The Week, but he thought this through very carefully. He'd, when he's in Washington, he'd found somebody who was a journalist who was combating a sort of enormous enterprise called the Radio Trust. It was all the biggest telecommunications companies that had a great sort of monopoly of information. It's rather like all the internet platforms here had combined, as they sort of largely have, to wipe out any competition and assert their full control of communications, radios and everything else. And one guy, just by observing them, by keeping us a running commentary, very accurate of all their misdeeds, began to wear them down, and eventually defeated them. So he got the message that you could, it was done by basically producing stories that then went to other journalists. You could do it in Washington, because there were so many other news outlets. So he thought, kept this in mind as a sort of David against Goliath, which had really worked. When he got to Berlin, there was a particularly unpleasant German general who had been Chancellor called von Schleicher, who had another newsletter, but people sort of had to read it because it was the inside track. So he thought, why not do the same in Britain? And bear in mind that all the newspapers there had, most of them had said, Hitler comes in, don't expect him to carry out anything radical, all these sort of populists, when they get in, they soon accommodate themselves to the existing state of things. He thought exactly the opposite. He thought the Nazis were going to do exactly what they said they were going to do. So he set up this newsletter. He also, from the very beginning, there are accounts in it of the persecution and murder of the Jews and so forth, when all the other papers were not writing about this. Initially, it didn't do too well, and after a bit, he found he had only 7 subscribers. But actually, he was partly rescued by Ramsay MacDonald. Somebody had given Ramsay MacDonald a copy of The Week, and Ramsay MacDonald, who had very thin skin, I think it discovered a piece which denounced a World Economic Conference that MacDonald had started in London, saying it was dead on its feet and so forth. So it was denounced by MacDonald, much to the pleasure of Claude, and the subscription sort of rapidly increased. And it worked because it was sort of in a vacuum of information, but two, this sort of thing never works unless you can sort of, what you do is topical, and secondly, that you get it right, because it won't get picked up by other journalists if they think it's wrong, or if it turns out you've given them a scoop. They probably won't tell you they got their scoop from you, but they'll be very upset if that scoop turns out to be untrue. and he was very good at sort of finding, particularly in the 30s, you know, there was dissent everywhere. There was dissent within the government, so you could find ministers and officials who would tell you what they really thought about appeasement or anything else. You would find foreign journalists in London who couldn't get their stories into their own newspapers, but were still pretty well informed. You could find sort of, if you know, the French Foreign Office or somebody else who, other foreign ministries who were at daggers drawn with each other, would tell you things. So reading through, I mean, one can now read all the copies of the week, and it is very impressive, the amount he knew. And this worried MI5 a lot, particularly if there were accounts of a cabinet meeting that had happened 2 days earlier, saying what the sort of position of the Prime Minister and the other government departments were. So this really was quite impressive, and began to have an impact fairly soon. MI5 would sort of send sort of freelance agents round to the office, which was an attic in Great Victoria Street, in just outside Westminster Abbey. I think it's gone now. I think it's where New Scotland Yard is. So this was pretty effective. At the same time, Claude had moved pretty decisively to the left. He became sort of been moving towards the communists for some time. And his basic feeling was that in Germany, the only really effective opposition, the only people who could really fight the Nazis were the communists. He felt the Social Democrats always failed to do anything effective. People used to say to him later, "Why aren't you more moderate?" And he said, "Well, you know, moderates are always saying that to me, but I should move more to the center, but they never actually do anything." And in the sort of, and he felt that throughout the 30s. But he also felt another thing, that you needed, for organization and opposition, you needed people who were really tough, who were really determined, who were really prepared to fight, people who were really prepared to get killed. But you also needed to have a popular front, which of people who might be high Tories, who might be oppose you in many other things, but on certain issues, let's say opposition to the Nazis, but other things, civil rights and so forth, they stood on the same side that you did. And eventually the Communist Party sort of had the same line, but he was pursuing this earlier on. And he started writing for the Daily Worker. His first big article was about something called the Gresford mine disaster in North Wales, and completely forgotten now, but 266 people were killed in a sort of ill-maintained mine. So he wrote aggressively about that. He sort of believed in opposing the government on pretty well everything. He was a founding member of the National Council for Civil Liberties, and because of marches of unemployed to London at that time, being attacked by the police and so forth, and they would get sort of well-known sort of intellectuals, writers like H.G. Wells and so forth, to sort of stand and monitor and see what the police did, on the grounds that their evidence would probably be more impressive in court, and this would restrain the police, which turned out to be pretty effective. This was leading up to the Spanish Civil War, which actually gets predicted in one copy of the week, saying there's about to be a putsch. He was actually in Spain, though he claimed he was there by accident, when Franco, in the Spanish army, tried to started their putsch. He participated. He joined the volunteers before the International Brigade. He'd already joined Spanish volunteers. Took part in a big battle west of Madrid, which he describes in a book called Reporter in Spain. Which actually holds up pretty well, I think. It's sort of propagandistic in tone, but also it's fairly convincing. He moved very much towards a Republican government, became very much a sort of an activist in the Republican government. This did his reputation a certain amount of damage later, because at one moment, and it was something he's rather proud of having done, that he, and I remember he was working for the Republican government at the time, that they wanted to get some field guns across the border from France, had been held up by the French government, and they thought if they persuade the French government that the Republic had a fighting chance of winning, the French might let them through. So he and somebody else, a guy called Otto Katz, invented a mutiny in the Spanish army, in Franco's Spanish army, back in North Africa, and made a very sort of detailed account of it. Invented this. Then later he was attacked, and he thought, I think actually it was rather unfair that he'd made this up. And he said, well, look, what did the people who had accused him of sort of journalistic malpractice, that 5 years later they were doing exactly the same thing in Britain, when the Foreign Office, others had whole departments geared to inventing untrue things that would damage the Nazis. Another thing that was held against him, that he had a quarrel with George Orwell. In 1937, there was a sort of civil war within the civil war, that the anarchists and Trotskyists who held Catalonia, who were very brave, but were separate from the Republican government, and they had a clash. Orwell was fighting with the Trotskyists in Catalonia, and attacked Claude for saying that they had taken weapons from government armories and done other things. Because it sort of subsequently, Claude could sort of later could sort of see his point, but felt it was all trivial. And Orwell sort of later said, well, all that didn't really matter, because the thing about the Spanish War is the wrong side won. And it was pretty horrific. It's sort of, I don't know how far it's penetrated now, but hundreds of thousands were killed. An excellent book by Paul Preston, The Spanish Holocaust. It was a war of extraordinary ferocity, and Franco was, the regime was certainly worse than Mussolini. Killed far more people. Claude sort of opposed the government all along the line during the abdication crisis. He sort of, at one moment, the Mountbatten was sort of had made contact, because they wanted him to publish stuff supportive of the king. So people on the left said, well, why on earth are you doing this? And he sort of said, well, I'll do anything for anybody who's again the government. Later, the most famous thing that the Week did was against appeasement, against the Cliveden Set, and exposing that the sort of aristocrats, newspaper, big business, and so forth, who were basically sort of pro-German. Sorry, how long have I been talking for now? How much time have I got left?
Another 10 or 15 minutes, probably, Patrick, if that's okay with you.
Sorry, I didn't glance at my watch when I started this. I mean, he knew all about sort of Nancy Astor, and the Astor family owned the Times, and they owned the Observer. Dawson, Claude's old editor, was very pro-appeasement, very powerful figure, largely forgotten. And these combined with sort of Lord Halifax and members of the government, Chamberlain himself, and so forth. Claude sort of had been writing about this for some time. He said without any effect at all. And then he produced the phrase Cliveden Set, and suddenly it took off, and had a very sort of, it made it very difficult for the Astors or the pro-appeasement parts of the establishment to ever sort of regain that credibility that they had before. So that was probably the most effective thing that the week did. But generally along the line, it became very influential. By sort of 1938, 39, Claude wrote that, you know, he said in some way, because there was a horrible sort of fascination and almost a relief that all the grim things that you prophesied and been fighting against actually happened. And it showed that people who'd been arguing against you had got it wrong. But of course, it was completely catastrophic. He was in sort of, went to Ruthenia in eastern Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, in just after Munich, and had a sort of long account of visiting, you know, the heavy Jewish population who were going to be exterminated a few years later, talking to them and so forth. There was an ominous feel. Although communist, he never went to Russia, but he did know and like quite a lot of Russians, notably somebody called Mikhail Koltsov, who was foreign editor of Pravda at one time, had been close to Stalin, but these were advocates of the Popular Front. But all these people began to disappear. Koltsov, I think, was arrested at the end of 38 and shot in 1940. He found that the Russians were sort of tough but realistic without being romantic, that they would actually fight. Come the beginning of the war, he wasn't that shocked by the Nazi-Soviet pact, because he thought that if the Russians thought that the British and the French could do another deal with Hitler as they had over Czechoslovakia, that just for reasons of realpolitik, that it was quite likely the Russians would try and do it first, which is kind of what happened. But he could also see that this was the end of sort of ideas of the Popular Front, and the type of politics that he'd been pursuing. He later felt from about 1940 he probably should have closed the week down, because actually most of the things he'd wanted actually happened. He'd wanted an alliance with the Soviet Union against Hitler, and they had that under Churchill. He wanted a sort of Popular Front government in Britain, and they sort of had that with the government of Churchill and Labour Party and National Government. So he'd achieved most of what he wanted, but he didn't quite recognize this himself. He was so sort of anti-government, so he maintained the weak. He remained in the Communist Party, and only later drifted out of it. But drift is probably the wrong word, because he always, one feature was he always felt, and remember he was brought up in the sort of politics of, very savage politics of Central Europe, that all these things that the communists were denounced for doing, often rightly, for massacring people and so forth, that the other side, the capitalist powers, would do themselves given half a chance, and did. So he felt he would never do anything which would, in a later period, bring any joy to the heart of, Senator McCarthy. And actually was denounced by McCarthy in 1952 as one of the more dangerous Reds in the world. At about the same time that an old friend of his, Otto Katz, in Czechoslovakia, was executed there for being lured into by British agent Cockburn. And of course, poor cat's probably been tortured and probably want to incriminate somebody outside the country, or had no choice. From the late 40s, and this book sort of goes up onto, there was really goes up to 1947, and then the chapter on what happened afterwards when he moved with my mother to Ireland. My mother came from Ireland, from County Cork, moved over there. And then, just to conclude, I mean, he didn't change his politics at all. He remained very much a revolutionary, he was very, and believed in attacking the powers that be at all times. He believed that all governments really tended to authoritarianism, and you had to keep battering away to all the time. This was more difficult to do in the early 50s. He had to work under lots of pseudonyms because, as a not so ex-Red, he was so blacklisted everywhere. He did have a successful movie with John Huston and others, but things were financially dicey. He was involved with Malcolm Muggeridge and Punch. There was a brief moment where Punch magazine, which was pretty dead in the water, was taken over by Malcolm Muggeridge, then in a radical phase, and became quite a sort of radical private eye type paper for a time, much attacked by the establishment. And during all this period, newspapers never sort of at any time dwell on their past mistakes. But during the 30s, it wasn't that the press was pro appeasement, but they were absolutely 100% pro appeasement right up to 1940, until Churchill came into power. There wasn't a sort of chink, even when it's often said the public opinion, was pro appeasement. But actually, researching this, I discovered that one newspaper had a public opinion poll showing that nobody trusted Hitler and the Munich Agreement and so forth. They simply didn't publish it. And the newspapers in the 50s, early 50s, Punch got into trouble because Churchill had a stroke when he was prime minister, and was visibly, it was rather like Biden today, was visibly unable to cope, but nobody was referring to this. Punch did, had a cartoon about this, an article about this, and got attacked from everywhere. Claude's health began to deteriorate. He had TB. I myself got polio, bad period in the late 50s. But in the early 60s, you began to have the early sort of satire, Peter Cook, and the foundation of Private Eye. And Private Eye was very much his type of magazine, and very much like The Week. And he contributed to it, although he was at one moment in 62 or so forth, he was guest editor, and he immediately named the head of MI5, which was known but nobody published. And immediately there was sort of the permanent secretary of the cabinet, so called an emergency meeting, and would they arrest him and so forth. But there were other things not to do with government. People knew about the Cray twins in the early 60s in London, but nobody had actually published their names. So Peter Cook and he were joint editing at that time, published the names of the Cray twins rather nervously, and both sort of left London in opposite directions. And Peter Cook went to Tenerife, and Claude returned to Ireland. And Peter Cook said their motto was publish and be absent, which they did. In fact, the Cratins didn't retaliate against them. So look, I'll stop about there, but I think that one of the purposes of this book was to show that skilled journalistic resistance does work. But you have to know how to do it. You have to know stories that are going to be picked up, stories that resonate, stories that are a certain style. And this does work. And he felt that, the old saying that that the telling truth to power. He didn't believe in a moment for telling truth to power. He thought if they had done the slightest desire to hear the truth, which they knew was much against their interests. But he did believe in telling the truth to the powerless, and he thought that would bring them real power, and then they could do something about the state of the world. So let me end it there.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was very interesting. I'm sure many of us look forward to reading your book. It was interesting that you ended with Claud Cockburn's role in Private Eye, because that follows on nicely from our last session, where we did actually also talk about Paul Foot's role in Private Eye in a later period. Anyway, who wants to go first? It's best if you look at the reactions button and press it and do the hands up. So I can't see anybody wanting to jump in. I'll pause a minute or two. Who wants to go first? I can't see anybody. Right. Right, yes, okay. Mike, wait.
Thanks very much, Duncan, and thanks so much, Patrick. I just wanted to ask you to say a bit about your thinking on the effects of the very changed kind of landscape in terms of the media, given social media, given what some people refer to as the post-truth age. It seems to me that journalistic resistance of the kind that the week carried out very much depended on the costs that there would be for the powerful of people exposing the truth. And in a world where bullshitters are taking up a presidential position and lies and mistruths are being promoted in a kind of industrial manner, to what degree does the kind of demoralization and the disorganization of the concept of truth present a barrier to effective guerrilla journalism, if indeed you do accept that the landscape has changed in problematic ways in that regard?
I'm not sure. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not sure it has changed that amount, to a degree it has, but I think, people, I think, underestimate that the poor old truth wasn't doing too well anyway, long before the present era, I mean, I've done a great deal of war reporting, and people say, it's all governments tell lies the whole time, but governments have been telling lies about wars since the time of the pharaohs, who were, putting up hieroglyphs, telling, claiming victories that never happened. How much worse has it got? I'm not sure it has got that much worse. It seems to be more better organized by governments. Their sort of PR is greater. Truth in journalism, people talk about fake facts, but there are certain, this is true, one knows, one hardly needs to say that, people who own newspapers and so forth pursue their partisan, self-interested agenda. But there are also things about newspapers that, have I got this right, John? There are also things about newspapers, which also militate against the truth. The truth is what really happening is always rather complicated, but newspapers dilute what's happening to make it to oversimplify. Already you move from the truth. The newspapers and public, they want to reach a wider audience. Again, exactly what has happened is difficult to convey. I think that people get sort of too depressed about this. One looks at Britain today, the collapse of the provincial press. It's actually rather difficult to find out what's happening in an area of Britain, because there used to be a provincial press that covered it. They don't anymore, whether you're in Dover or Hereford or Salford, it's actually, if you Google these, and yup, you can Google any information, but then you discover there isn't much worth reading about any of these places. I say this because I've been trying to sort of do this, of going to different places, interviewing lots of places, people. So yeah, it is. I mean, this is true, but I think one should also try and, I think there are ways of kicking back, that one shouldn't think, we're in sort of a post-truth era. I think that's an exaggeration.
Thank you.
Helen Mercer, you're next.
Hi, thank you very much, Patrick. That was really very interesting. And I just wanted to draw a parallel that perhaps the modern day journalist who perhaps most resembles Claud Cockburn would actually be Julian Assange, because it's very much the same model, that the determination to get the facts out and to get them, he's not so bothered about talking truth to power as talking truth to as wide a group of people as possible, and creating this system whereby people can give him an inside track via this box that he set up, this drop box that he set up. And I mean, it's also following it. It's topical, it's accurate. So it's very much in terms of what you were talking about, Patrick, very much in that model. The trouble is that, well, two problems really. One is that it seems to me the monopolisation of the media has gone a lot further than it was in Claud Cockburn's day, even when I was young. And so that's one problem. But the second problem is that the powers of the state to suppress this have also proven themselves to be much stronger and much more determined. So while I agree with you, I'm sure there are ways of doing what Claud Cockburn was trying to do. I think that the problems are more intense.
Yeah, I think there's a good deal in what you say. I read quite a lot about Assange. And it was completely disgraceful, the way he was hounded. And it also shows the extreme sensitivity of governments, that they're sort of, even when, what he revealed wasn't that secret. I mean, although they kept on pretending that people have been killed because of him and put great resources, it's completely untrue. But it shows the sensitivity of governments to anybody, if their sort of claim to be the owner of secrets is in any way threatened, the sort of violence with which they react. And you could see that within the whole sort of Assange case, the tremendous impacts and the tremendous resources that the American, British, Swedish state mobilized to pursue him. How different is that from the past? I'm not sure. To some extent, it's greater. What happened to German journalists in Germany is they got shot, similarly in Italy and Spain, similarly in Gaza today. But there isn't quite an Assange case. So when I think of Assange, I think it's somewhat different, but I think of the Dreyfus case in France. But Claude used to have a way of, he used to be accused of, this may sound slightly a tangent, but it isn't really. He used to be accused of sort of knowing high Tories and others who weren't on the left, although he was a communist. And he'd say, well, look, he had a picture in his mind that he would imagine that people, what position would they have taken during the Dreyfus case in France, the Jewish army officer who was falsely claimed to be a spy, sent to Devil's Island, and although it was known he was innocent, there were campaigns to release him. He used to think, what position would people have taken in the Dreyfus case, and if he felt that basically they wouldn't have campaigned for Dreyfus's innocence, then they weren't people he wanted to be associated with. I felt a bit the same myself during the Assange case. I felt people who sort of not only attacked Assange, journalists who attacked Assange, but journalists who were silent about Assange, and an appalling number were, were sort of complicit in what the government was doing. So I did find it very depressing. How symbolic it is of what's happening to the press in general, I'm not sure. You may well be right that it shows things have got worse, but I don't think that they've got irretrievably worse. Sorry, it's rather a long question, but it's, those are my thoughts.
Thanks. David Morgan, you're next.
Thank you, Patrick. Excellent talk. I haven't got the book yet, but I look forward to getting it at some stage. I know Claude's work from when I was studying literature in the 80s, actually. I got interested in him through writing about Graham Greene. But what I'd want to ask is, you said Claude was in Vienna for a while in the, was it late 20s, early 30s? I wondered if he knew Karl Kraus, who I think died in 1936. He was a courageous journalist and satirist and exposing the establishment in, I think he was working from the early 1900s to about to the 1930s. He had a publication called The Torch, and that ran for about 30 years or more, and it was quite popular amongst radical circles. I'm just wondering if Claude would have known about that, maybe even met Kraus.
He might have, because he was part of sort of radical circles, there, progressive circles in Vienna. So he may well have done. He thought that sort of radical journalism should use every trick used by popular journalism. He was sort of associated with somebody called Willy Monsenberg, who was the German communist who sort of, they'd set up popular magazines and so forth. Otto Katz I mentioned. There were other sort of Czech, mostly very sort of tough anti-Nazi figures that he was associated with. But he was very sort of interested in the mechanisms of propaganda. And again, in his sort of writings, he was very sort of open about how journalism works, you know. Didn't necessarily do him a lot of good, you know. Journalists like myself often say, I simply report the facts, you know, but it's fairly pretty common sense. Since there's an infinite number of facts in the world, that you have to pre-select facts which you think are important, therefore your judgment is involved. So all sort of writing is partisan. You know, hopefully in my case, I'd like to think it's partisan to what I think is the truth. But the idea that there are sort of 6 facts of the world that you can pick up and shove in the newspaper, you know, is very naive.
Francis King.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. Back in the days when I was an archivist, we used to have a few copies of The Week in our collection. We never full run, unfortunately. And one of the things that I always found surprising about a publication which is clearly influential and people talked about is that it was produced in this, you know, basically on a duplicator. At a time when normally in publishing, if you know, the aim of every publication is to get more and more professional, more pages, you know, fancy allowed. It stayed in this duplicated format. And I wonder why that was. Was it simply that way Claude had the maximum control over the entire process, or was it an economic thing, or was there some other reason?
It was a combination of these things. First of all, he had no money. He had about £40 he'd borrowed. Secondly, he thought if publication looked poor and was poor, nobody would sue you. Because, you know, people sue you, and I've worked on Private Eye, you know, people sue you for all sorts of reasons, but a main one is, a very important one, is to make some money. If you have no resources, they realize that, you know, there's nothing they can actually take away from you. He also wanted to sort of remain in control of this. He had a horror. He say, I didn't leave the Times in order to have editorial committees and stuff like this. He also, you know, he was kind of a tough guy. He felt he could sort of endure all this. You know, quite a lot of time he had no money when this, endure all this. I think he but he wanted to keep it sort of very coherent and very sort of pointed. And that meant doing it all himself. So I think that and he thought that also it sort of, you could make a virtue, it felt more dissident if you had a sort of grubby newsletter arriving, rather than if you attempted to produce a spectacle.
Thanks. I can't see any other hands up at the moment. I saw John Atfield's hand up earlier. Did you want to ask a question still or not?
Well, I was going to, but Mike and Helen basically asked what I was intending to ask. I did want to say, in terms of Claud Cockburn's journalism, one of my favorite stories about him was when he was on the Times and they had that informal kind of competition among the journalists who could write the most boring headline and get it through the editors so that it got printed. And he won it on one occasion with, what was it, Patrick? Small earthquake in Chile, not many dead.
Exactly that.
Yeah. As somebody who's largely given up on mainstream media, and I spend really most of my time following what I would describe as independent journalism, mostly on the internet. My feeling is that things have changed significantly away from mainstream media. We hear about, in the USA, for example, the dramatic falls in the readership of the main press. Whereas in the USA, actually, there is, I think, more diversity in the mainstream media than there is in the UK or in Germany, where I am. But with the internet and the growth of independent journalists or commentators, whatever you like to label them as, that's the area where I would have said that is today's guerrilla journalism. But I don't know whether I'm over-romanticizing it or whatever. I wonder, Patrick, what is your view on that?
No, I think that's exactly so. But there are just, newspapers were sustained by advertising revenue. They don't get that anymore, or anything like the way they did. There's also, you have a sort of de-skilling, of if people don't have a job as a journalist, the overall level of information available goes right down. You look at England, for instance, or you look at America, all the local press has disappeared, but it's not really been replaced by anything. You do have sort of many more outlets for sort of guerrilla type operations, but the whole sort of media landscape has changed. In some ways it's freer, in other ways the whole sort of level of information that you can access has gone right down. Whether it'll bounce back, we'll see. But it's a rather extraordinary development, and obviously a pretty sort of negative one. There are more sort of independent operations starting up, and they often fill a vacuum in cities like Manchester and other places, but it's not, it's still fairly limited. It's pretty amazing, that London, this gigantic wealthy city, used to have the Evening Standard, the Evening News, and lots of other local publications. It hardly has anything these days. There's a great sort of vacuum of information.
Chris Norris.
You're still,
I think I'm on now. Yeah.
Yeah, you're on.
Yeah. Part of the problem is that people who have been up to now pretty reliably on the left, maybe not all of them on the radical left, but people well to the sort of left liberal, and nowadays spending so much time, unnecessarily so, attacking people, and some of them are ex-colleagues, or at least people broadly on their wavelength before, who are now working for organizations like the BBC. I mean, it's so, I mean, God knows the BBC record of decent reportage from various trouble spots around the world is pretty dubious. But now, you know, especially over Palestine, the extent of BBC bias at the highest management level, an intrusion, and well, now there are many people actually on the front line of reporting and who know their subject about the Middle East are now spending so much time fighting management and trying to get a decent public hearing for what they're doing, which of course the BBC won't cover. And the Guardian's been noticeably quiet about it. People like Owen Jones. I mean, there's such a chronic wastage of really good sort of journalistic muscle power and commitment that goes into what is sure to look from the outside like internecine squabbling. That's what makes the whole scene depressing.
You know, this is true. In most of these organizations, there are people trying to do, you know, stuff. One thing that occurs to me is that when they do succeed, every so often, let's say on CNN or something, you suddenly have a very heavily researched article that's on what's happening in Gaza, which is pretty good. I always feel that those who are sort of sympathetic to the Palestinians in Gaza should sort of push this around. Similarly, in the New York Times, every so often, those who feel that they should give a more accurate account of what's happening win out. And I think that sort of needs to be pushed around. I don't think it's a battle sort of totally lost. I think, you know, one of the good, there's nothing good about Gaza, but in terms of the media, the fact, you know, that phones can show you, phone cameras can show you these sort of, you know, children who have been, you know, badly wounded or blinded or mangled by bombs, you know, that can be shown to the outside world. You know, I used to, when I covered Sabra Shatila, you know, there was very little of that, certainly not contemporary. You know, you remember Sabra Shatila in South Beirut in 1982, 1,500 dead minimum, Palestinians, men, mostly women and children, actually. I remember that vividly when I was walking around there. But so in some ways, you know, it's not wholly negative that these things can be made visible these days.
Right. Well, I'm waiting for anybody else to put their hand up. Can I just sort of take us back a bit to Claud Cockburn? I'm just interested in his relationship with the Communist Party leadership, with Pollitt and Dutt, and to what extent, you know, there was a discussion about the content of his material, either before he published it or afterwards. I don't know to what extent, you know, there was a difference of view and how that was handled.
I think he was sort of, you know, most of what he was doing, let's say when he was in Spain, is what they wanted, you know. Funny, I did look at the Russian archives, and they didn't sort of like quite a lot of what he had, what he was writing, but and so sent, you know, in fact, they wanted to get him sacked by the British Party and from the Daily Worker. There'd been a speech by Stalin, which he'd sort of edited and cut out a large part of it. They're pretty angry at that. But there was also, you know, departures from the party line. After the war, when he sort of 1940 on, the week was banned. He said the party leaders were quite keen for it not to reopen because they felt that everything in it was attributed to them, but in fact it was him. But he felt he should sort of keep this as an independent organ. He didn't have big clashes with them. I mean, other people complained about the rigorous discipline of the Communist Party. He said them and the Comintern were, you know, a lot of the time are sort of shambles, or rather badly organized, even if they're better organized than other people. But he didn't. I mean, there were a lot of things in the Spanish War that other sort of intellectuals were sort of disillusioned by. But you know, he felt that's the nature of warfare, you know. You're fighting a savage civil war, you know, very nasty things are going to happen. And then again, I think being brought up in Central and Eastern Europe made him sort of, in times of war and terror and so forth, made him more, not accepting of that, but maybe accepting that as a sort of a fact of political life. But going back to your question, he didn't really have any quarrels with them. And even when he departed, he did so sort of fairly quietly. He didn't sort of write great resignation letters or anything. So as I said, he was very determined that he wasn't going to go out and denounce the communists when he thought that the Western powers, the capitalists, would have done exactly the same thing given half a chance.
Thanks for that. Anybody else? Last chance to ask a question to Patrick. Right, I can't see anybody waving. Right, Patrick, do you want to say a few final words?
Well, thanks very much. I enjoyed doing that. Interested to see how people watching this respond to the book, which I hope you'll buy. But I think it is sort of relevant. I have been sort of talking things up a bit, but I think there's slightly too much gloom about the state of the media. Gloomy it is, yes. But I don't, you know, Claud was very sort of upbeat, always believed in the counterattack, always thinking of new tactics, how to resist the powers. I think that one should sort of think along those lines rather than feeling that, which, you know, I can well understand, that everything is bad and getting worse, and indeed everything else. Thank you very much, anyway.
Thanks very much, Patrick. Right, just before we close, if I can just make a couple of announcements. Firstly, for those of you that are Socialist Society members already, subscriptions for 2025 are now due. For those of you that aren't, please do join. In joining the Society, not only do you get notifications of our online talks, but you also get our Socialist History Journal twice a year, normally a couple of occasional publications a year, and also our newsletter. So the detailed rates are now on the screen, thanks to Francis, who is our treasurer. In terms of forthcoming events, David Morgan, our secretary, has organised a whole series of events for the new year. So on 12th of February, we have Sheila Rowbottom talking about UK politics in the 1980s. That's based mainly on the third volume of her autobiography, which has come out very recently. On the 5th of March, we have Imperial Politics in the Indian Ocean with Lala Khalili. We sort of decided we'd got a bit Eurocentric, so we're trying to broaden out some of our coverage from speakers. On the 3rd of April, we have another session on A.L. Morton, this time from James Crosley, on A.L. Morton and the People's History of England, who's written a full-length biography of A.L. Morton. In addition, those are all online. So keep an eye on our website, Social History Society website. We're also planning a face-to-face session for our AGM, probably on the 3rd of May. So look out for information on that. So thanks to everybody for joining us, and thanks very much to Patrick for his very interesting presentation. Okay, you can all clap now. Thank you, Patrick, and look forward to seeing many of you at one of our future sessions. Happy New Year, comrades. Hopefully it's happy.
Thank you so much.
Yes, the talk will be on the website as soon as we've sorted out the technical details, but normally we get on with a few days.
Thank you. Thank you, Duncan.
Thanks, everybody.
Hello. Duncan, while you're still there,
Yep.
Can you, Duncan?
Yes, I can hear you.
Is there an echo now?
No, there wasn't an echo at all through that whole session. It went
Right.
after about a couple of minutes. I don't know
Because
where
I
the echo.
muted- Right.
Hmm?
I know what caused it. It was me. And I
Yeah,
managed to stop it.
I wondered about that, but when I realised it was certainly wasn't me and it wasn't Patrick and everybody else was muted.
No, it was. I'm just. This is just a technical check, so I know what to do next time, so it doesn't happen. Right, that's fine.
Yeah,
It was-
well, I'm on a new computer, so for last week I couldn't get the audio to work at all. Never mind the mic. So fortunately that was sorted a couple of days ago.
We can hear you much better than we used to.
Well, that's what several people said on a session I did yesterday or the day before. So my old computer was just so old, it finally collapsed just before Christmas, which I thought I'd lost absolutely everything in terms of all my records and everything. But I managed to get back into my email because I didn't even know the password because it'd been on there for 20 years. And my daughter, who was my rescue person, was actually in Tokyo at the time, but she managed to reconnect my email from Tokyo, which was very impressive. It's what you have kids for.
But anyway, well, we've got a good recording that will go up on YouTube, presumably.
And I'd